Good evening, and welcome to Insights powered by Barnard. My name is AJ Ehrenstein, and I'm Dean of Beyond Barnard, the college's hub for advising and resources around careers, internships, competitive fellowships, and applications to graduate and professional school. Over the last 6 months, this series has given us the opportunity to hear from a range of exceptional leaders in politics, healthcare, business, media, and journalism. Tonight's event will mark the finale of the 2020 season of Insights powered by Barnard. And as you'll hear for yourselves really shortly, we are exceptionally fortunate to mark this conclusion with Lareina Yee, Barnard class of 1995, who's senior partner at McKinsey Company and the firm's chief diversity and inclusion officer. I want to extend a special welcome to Lareina on behalf of Beyond Barnard. In September 2019, she served as the keynote speaker at our fall semester opportunities fair, where she presented remarks on the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion across career fields. We're excited to hear her thoughts on the ways that the unprecedented events of the last year have reshaped the landscape of this work. Before we begin, just a few logistical notes. The event is being recorded and will be shared next week. Attendees, however, will not have microphone or camera access during the event. Attendees' voices, likenesses, and images will not be captured by Barnard College. Written submission of questions may be shared during the Q&A portion of the event. And with that in mind, as always, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce the 8th president of Barnard, Sian Leah Bylock. President Bylock has led Barnard since 2017, having served for 12 years at the University of Chicago. She is one of the world's leading experts on the cognitive science behind choking under pressure and performance anxiety, with a focus on math and science for women and girls. She's the author of 2 critically acclaimed books entitled Choke and How the Body Knows Its Mind, and her 2018 TED Talk has been viewed over 2 million times. Please join me in welcoming President Bylock.
Thank you, AJ, and welcome to all of you. I'm so glad to be with you this evening. This is the inaugural season of Insights powered by Barnard series, and it's been such a great success. And I've so enjoyed these opportunities to engage with such distinct women and to come together as a community for conversations about some of the most challenging times we've faced during 2020. It's really an appropriate week to have our next guest here with us, Lareina Yee, whose leadership in diversity and inclusion and whose work to understand the picture of women in the workplace has actually helped inform what we do at the college. This is an appropriate week because each year Barnard evaluates the first destination of our newest alumni. Through surveys and research conducted by Beyond Barnard, we determine where members of the most recent graduating class are working or enrolled in graduate school, professional school, medical school within 6 months of graduation. I think this is a really important analysis that we started 3 years ago because it's important to show what a Barnard education does in terms of the next steps our alums take. And I'm pleased to share that this initial analysis, which closed on Sunday night, so these are data hot off the press, which I think demonstrates a significant resilience of the class of 2020 who graduated in a pandemic. We have almost 90% of our students within 6 months for the class of 2020 working or enrolled in graduate study. This is even despite the incredible challenges presented by COVID-19. And this number compares favorably to the last 2 years, where we've been over 90% in our students who are in full-time jobs or grad school within 6 months. And as always, this full report will be available by mid-December through Beyond Barnard. These are what we think as of incredibly strong results. But as I know, and we will discuss this evening, the economic conditions brought on by the pandemic are complex, evolving, and real. I know that individuals in our community have experienced substantial changes in their career situation, and we're cognizant of the talk of real economic recovery being not so close. So tonight, as always, I remind our entire Barnard community that we're here to support you. Students and alumni alike have access to all of the incredible resources offered through Beyond Barnard, and I hope you will be in touch to tap into those resources that are available to you. Beyond Barnard is really here to serve our Barnard family for their entire lifetime. With that, I turn to this evening's speaker, Lareina Yee, who's class of 1995. Lareina is a senior partner at McKinsey Company. She is also the firm's chief diversity and inclusion officer and a member of the Global Partnership Services team. At McKinsey, Lareina leads Women in the Workplace, a research partnership with leanin.org and the Wall Street Journal. Now in its 6th year, Women in the Workplace represents the largest comprehensive study of the state of women in corporate America. And I had the opportunity to speak last year at the Women in the Workplace Summit in San Francisco, and it was really a great pleasure. This year's report reveals some eye-opening findings about the way that COVID-19 has altered the landscape of employment for women. I read the report not too long ago, and among the numbers, it was really sobering to know that more than 1 in 4 women are contemplating downshifting their careers or leaving the workplace completely as a result of the pandemic. Lareina has spoken frequently with women in business, including at Fortune Magazine's Most Powerful Women Summit, the Makers Conference, Techonomy, the Professional Business Women of California Conference, and the Women's Forum in France. A graduate of both Barnard and Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, Lareina was an early adopter of the opportunity to earn a bachelor's and a master's at Barnard and Columbia in 5 years, our 4+1 programs. She was a history and political science major. She served as the Barnard Student Government Association president and was both a Javits Fellow and a Henry Luce Scholar. From 1996 to 97, she worked with the Foreign Relations Committee in the United States Senate, and she joined McKinsey in 2000 and has worked in both the Hong Kong and West Coast offices. Lareina is the mother of 3 boys, and she met her husband, Bert Galeno, while at Barnard, and he actually was a student at Columbia College and proposed to her on the Low Library steps. So please join me in welcoming Lareina Yee.
Now I'm embarrassed. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, my oldest is just turned 18. My youngest is 5. In the middle, we have a 14-year-old. To bring it home to the community at Barnard, some of my best friends and closest confidants are friends of mine from Barnard. One of them is the godmother of one of my sons. The other one is a Jewish godmother of 2 of my other kids, and really just the friendships and experience at Barnard have been so fundamental in shaping the resilience in my life. So yes, and my husband proposed at Low Library steps where we had our first hangout. So
well, that's wonderful. And it's wonderful to hear about your Barnard connections and how special they are. And it's so great to have you with us to conclude this 2020 Insight series, which we kicked off during the pandemic, where we knew people were looking for connections and looking to hear from inspiring women leaders. And so you're such an appropriate bookend to this fantastic event. So how are you doing? It's something that I've been asking all our speakers. How are you managing work and life during the last year? We'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. So today was a good day. So I come in with a huge smile, but I think for me, it's, I feel completely exhausted, as I'm sure everybody does. And I look for silver lining moments. And so I think one of the silver lining moments has been not traveling and resetting being with the family and having some time to actually step back and reflect. That said, I think the pace of work and the pace of life and what we talk about in the research in terms of what the double shift really means for women with children or women who have caretaking responsibilities of their family cannot be understated at this time.
So we're going to get to that because I want to hear all about the research, and I want to also learn about how to take some of the pressure off, as I experienced this in my own life, and I know many of our alums and parents and students do too. But before we get to the Women in the Workplace study, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your path from Barnard to the US Senate to McKinsey. What were those first few years like after you finished school? And how did you make this transition?
So sometimes people say, you know, what were you like in college? And I was on the more organized side. For people who know me, that's not a surprise. And I probably had a fixed view of what my dream job was. And so my dream job was to write policy papers in the US Senate. I thought like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing thing. I applied for tons of internships through the help of Barnard when I was in college and was so excited to go to SEPA. And then a funny thing happens, which is life throws you lots of curveballs. And the only reason why I mention this is what you think you may want to do and what you may pursue really passionately may not be the thing that you spend 20 years doing. And so all said and done, I loved being in the US Senate. When I was a staffer and a fellow there in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, there was this guy named Joe Biden, who was a senator. There was, it was, President Clinton was in office, and I know this was a long time ago for some of the alums, so it dates me incredibly old and dinosauric. But in any case, it was a really exciting time. And I think the piece that I really loved was the ability to think, and also the idea that you can be inside the system to help systems improve. And that must be the common thread, because when I joined McKinsey, I thought that the business analyst program was the best deal possible because I didn't know anything about McKinsey. But I was like, oh, and you don't expect me to stay. That's perfect because I'm on my way back to New York. and I joined, and one of the things that I realized is that it is so fun solving problems. And I was like, and you're paying me to do this? You're basically paying me to spend time solving problems and working with institutions. Like, that's amazing. So after 1 year, I was like, okay, now I'm going to do it for another year. And I did spend some time in the public sector. And one funny story I'll just share is that there was this one work stream. We call all the different pieces we work in project teams. There's one work stream that was supporting a regulatory review or regulatory committee. And everyone was like, oh, that just looks like the worst work stream. And I raised my hand. I was like, that sounds amazing. I would love to do it. I was so eager. They're like, oh my gosh, let that eager American, she really wants to work on that. And it ended up, being terrific. And so I think, one of the things is there's something about letting your curiosity, letting all your natural talents just take you where you go. If you had asked me when I graduated from Barnard, I would not have expected to spend my time in business and to spend my time in consulting per se. I thought I was going to have a life of public service.
Yeah, I love this sort of you looking back, and something that jumps out at me that everyone who we've talked to has talked about is the non-linearity. Like, you are, Barnard women are high achieving. They have academic excellence at the heart of them. They want to go on to do great things, and so many do. And when you have those skills, you often want to plan out your future and know what every turn holds. But it's something that I've found in my own career, and everyone consistently talks about that. It's about taking those opportunities that you didn't expect to come, or that other people didn't expect you to succeed at or want to do. And it sounds like that's something that you've really focused on, sort of jumping. Yeah.
And I think even within a job that you may have, my advice is, you don't know where that's going to take you. Some people ask why I spend time thinking about research on women. How did I become the chief diversity officer at McKinsey? And it wasn't obvious. My day job is I spend time with technology clients. And so those two things aren't, those are like pickles and peanut butter. They don't actually make a sandwich together. And maybe it has something to do with being at Barnard, but I had a sponsor and I had just become a partner, and this was quite a while ago. And he said, I just challenge you, Lareina, to think of something beyond what you're doing to have impact that you care about. It was very aspirational, very vague statement, but I went and thought about that. And what bothered me and what I couldn't get out of my mind is that every meeting I felt like I was going to, every time I was at an executive table, I was the only person of color. I was the only woman. Or maybe there was one other woman there. And I just remember thinking, this is not what it felt like or what it looked like or what my expectations were when I graduated from Barnard. And Madeline Albright was our commencement speaker. And I remember just being so inspired by her and what she had done in public policy, and just remembering some of that and thinking, this is not right. And then you have to say, well, then what could I do about it? And for McKinsey, like we, research and understanding business systems and problems is something that we can contribute. Everyone has a different way to contribute to it. But I think that takes you to a different place as well.
Yeah, that's great. So talk a little bit about your role as the Chief Diversity Officer, and especially at a company like McKinsey over the last year. As you know, there's a renewed focus on racial injustice. And I wonder what that's been like at McKinsey in your role in business more generally.
Yeah. So it's been intense. And I think that, a couple of things. One is, I think it is what we're doing is also happening as the fundamental role of business is changing. So I think the context in which all of this has shifted. So just as a very simple example, I think the scope of responsibilities of what good business leadership look like, kind of 20th century thinking was profitability, and you maximize shareholder profitability, and that's what you think about at the end of the day. I think there's a broader discussion in business about what some people call stakeholder capitalism. We call it 21st century companies, but the concept is actually leadership is a bigger canvas. So that may be the environment, that may be equity, that may be diversity, that may be a whole number of things. And when you start to reframe what our responsibilities and our scope is as leaders in business, that actually changes how seriously and with what fortitude you take something like diversity and equity inclusion. So on the one hand, I was thankful that we were doing work already, and I think a lot of companies who felt better. But when COVID hit, it was such an extreme shock. Immediately in our pulse data, I could see the impact on working parents, just the immediate piece. Immediately, we could see the stress and signs and the impact of unconscious bias. Immediately, we could see that our different affinity groups were having different reactions, right? And this is something similar to all companies. And so the ability to intervene, the ability to do something is really important. So I think what it's felt like, it's been a call to action. So it's less about words and it's about what are you doing? And the simple question of how I ended up in this role is I was driving a lot of our research, and our managing director was reading it, and he said, I think it's actually time that you implement what you're writing. So this is a moment of truth for a consultant to say, don't just observe, don't just advise, do it. And I think that's also been really exhilarating and really exciting.
I love that. Okay, I promise we're getting to women in the workplace, but I want to bring up, I guess it was it last fall that you were at Barnard or 2 falls ago? I can't remember. It all sort of blurred together now. When you came and did the Beyond Barnard a fall ago.
A fall ago, let's just call it that.
I remember you gave such a fantastic talk. I remember you had no slides and you had some note cards, and it was so cogent. But I also remember you telling the story of giving your first report at McKinsey to your boss and him telling you it was horrible.
Oh yes, I failed like no one's business. So if it's that you'd like me to retell the story. So I was writing policy papers, obviously, and then I worked for the Hong Kong legislature, and I was a loose scholar, so I was doing nonprofit work. I had never actually seen PowerPoint before. I had no idea what it was. I understood Excel because I had been at CEPA and I had done economic modeling, but truly, there was no one less prepared for a job at McKinsey on day one than me. And I went in there with my sunny disposition, ready to have impact. I'm like, I have some work experience. I'm starting with the entry-level role. It will all be fine. I get there, they ask me to do something. My project manager, engagement manager is like, here's what I'd like you to do. It's very straightforward. Can you research for companies and answer the following questions? He's like, oh, by the way, I have to go to Japan for 2 days or 3 days and I'll be back and then we'll check in. And I'm like, great, I'm just gonna attack this with all of my capabilities. And understand I was a political science history major, right? So he comes back, I have no idea you're supposed to put this on PowerPoint. And I submit like something like 4 pages, single space, no indentation, like just a paper. And I worked so card. I was so proud of it. And I gave it to him, and he looked at the other team member, and he just like, I was like, oh, this isn't going well. He was like, just looked at it like, I have no idea what to do with this. And the first thing he did was he took the piece of paper and he was like, first of all, there's this. And secondly, I don't even know. I don't even know kind of how to give you feedback. This is just so off the mark. And I just share it because I had a really hard first week, probably a hard first month. It's arguable whether it was harder for me or for my team. It all worked out okay. 20 years later, it's all good. But I think one of the capabilities that's so important is resilience and grit. So in a moment like that, you could just sort of cave in and be like, oh my gosh, I failed. Or you could be like, yeah, I failed spectacularly. And I'm going to get up and I'm going to figure out what that PowerPoint thing is. That seems like a useful tool. And I'm just going to crush it. And then you're like, okay, and I didn't crush it the next time, but I'm going to try again. And I think there's so much power in resilience and grit. And I know a lot of people write about it and talk about it, but I just think it's so important in what is a course of many failures and many successes in any career.
Yeah, and I really, that story resonated with me because, as you know, I'm a psychologist and I study how we succeed and also what happens when we fail and how we attribute failure. And it's, you know, there's a lot of work showing that women are more likely to attribute failure to themselves and their being, whereas men will attribute failure to some sort of external cause. And it changes your outlook about whether you're going to jump back in. And so I love that story of like someone who's only had success up to that point and getting that failure and jumping back in. And I thought that was great.
Yeah.
So let's talk about women in the workplace. Can you talk about the report and how you became involved in it?
Sure. So I think the most important statistic is what you mentioned, which is the finding was this year, 1 in 4 women in corporate America are thinking about stepping back or stepping out. This is a shocking number for a whole bunch of reasons. One is that never in the last 6 years as we've done this research, or really in the last decade when I've been looking at gender in the corporate sector, have we seen that attrition really differs between men and women. So it was a myth that we busted early on to say, women aren't leaving corporate America, you're just not promoting them or supporting them or creating an environment for them to succeed. And sort of switching the accountability back to the companies was a really important frame of the discussion.
Yeah, but I remember, just to interrupt, I remember the report a couple of years ago talking about that second rung on the ladder where women, it wasn't that women were leading, they just weren't getting promoted to that second spot at the same way. And this seems like very different data.
This is different. So this is saying that across, so our survey data is 40,000 men and women. They were surveyed between roughly end of May, June through August. So the only reason why I say that is not to get into the footnotes, but to say, this was a dipsy stick view of sentiment at a very large data set after George Floyd and after the first sprint of COVID. So there was enough time on ground, so to speak, for that sentiment analysis to be very telling. And so the first piece was 1 in 4 women. I think for all of those who are working mothers, by no surprise, there's a working mother story in that. And so if you're wondering the size and scale of the double shift, we, in our research, we estimated it was 3 hours on average a day.
So tell us, define the double shift for us and what that really means.
So double shift would be you have your paid job, your official job, that is, wherever you work. So if you are an investment banker on Wall Street, that's your job. Your second shift is the shift of unpaid labor at home. It can be household duties, childcare duties, all the extra load. And that is the actual physical load and the time load on top of your primary job. And what we see is, and measured in many different ways, is that women take on a higher double shift load than men. And in the course of the pandemic, that number has risen. And that load is not equally shared between men and women. Even if men perceive they are carrying the load, they are not.
I read that somewhere. I don't know if it was in the Women Work in Workplace report, but that men overestimated how much they were helping relative to what they were doing, and women were more accurate in their estimation.
Yes, I think the most provocative statistic came from the Wall Street Journal, or no, from the New York Times early on in the pandemic. But what we saw was that 77% of men in dual career, so where both men and women or both partners are working, 77% of men said, "Oh yes, I carry an equal load." Only 40% of women agreed with that generously. So maybe there was some lack of clarity on what it means to carry an equal load. I was like, that's a big delta. So the double is that shift and that second piece. So if you were to quantify that, let's say you have a 40-hour-a-week job. If you work 3 hours a day extra in home care, household duties, groceries, all of that during COVID, that is actually, if you add it up, 15 hours a week, it's essentially time and a half. So the one thing I have said to a lot of women is, if during COVID you feel tired, there's like a mathematical explanation for this. This is not your brain. This is not that you are weak. This is not that you are not trying hard enough. This isn't even resilience. We're not even there yet. This is you are actually working more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of my research has really shown that there's a biological basis you can see in the brain when people feel anxious or worried. Like if someone's worried about doing math, the networks in their brain involved in experiencing pain are active. So when people say math is painful, like their brain actually thinks it is. And I think research like this sort of brings it home that you don't just feel tired or exhausted, you're actually doing more work in many cases.
And actually that point about if math feels like it hurts, it's not just the physical amount of labor. The other piece of what we found is that women, far more than men, felt that they were going to be professionally penalized for the extra shift that they have or for their extra household responsibilities. And that's insane in a world where those are not controllable responsibilities. So if schools are not in person and you have, like, I have 3 kids Zooming at home, that is not that I am choosing to do, it is a necessity, it's a structural shift. And so the idea that women feel quite worried about a professional penalty for that, that's not okay. And I'm not quite sure why men don't feel that, or why they feel more confident that that's not going to hurt them. But that's not a healthy signal in a workplace.
So how does this relate to a lot of companies signaling that people can do remote work from now on? I mean, I wonder if that has negative implications for women in terms of the amount of work they take on in the home as well.
Yeah, I think this is a story that hasn't played out yet. So on the one hand, what we know in all previous years is that the lack of flexibility was the #1 cited barrier. And much of that was that you always had to be in the office, or you felt like you had to have FaceTime, or you felt like you couldn't pick up if you're a working mom, you couldn't pick up your child, or if you're a senior woman, that you were just always on, irrespective of having kids. So what's great about COVID is it has accelerated our ability to use this whole video format. It has accelerated so much in our ability to rethink what workflow looks like. The challenge is right now is we're sleeping in the office, and it's extremely extreme. So the question is, when we don't have the conditions of a pandemic, when we have a more balanced set of support services, schools, when we are not in such a heightened environment, will we snap back to how we worked before, or will we actually innovate how we work? And I think a lot of companies are spending quite a lot of time thinking about which jobs could be hybrid, which jobs could be remote, how would they refashion it? And some of it actually is economically driven to say, do we need as much real estate? Or do we come back after the pandemic differently? Could we hire from different cities in the United States because they don't actually have to be in person all the time? So would that, for example, allow us to be more successful in hiring Black talent?
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I haven't heard the conversation about thinking about diversifying a company's workforce sort of coincide with the virtual versus not. I wonder if there are particular things that companies are doing to think about that specifically.
Yeah, I think companies are thinking about diversifying talent, and that's two things. One is kind of talent right out of college and graduate schools, but also experienced hires. So one of the things we know dilutes the percentage of women's representation is that when you're hiring managers, VPs, people with 5 to 10 years experience, those workflows or those talent pools are disproportionately men.
Yeah.
So even if they have sort of pulled more equity in the college level recruiting, it's diminished by the second effect.
Yeah.
And so if you were to say, look, I'm not so tethered, I live in San Francisco, I'm not so tethered to hiring talent in San Francisco, that may open up the ability to find amazing women engineers, Black engineers, Latinx engineers. And so I think there is some promise to that. Now, I think part of the challenge is that the systems aren't geared, like the natural sort of momentum is to do the thing the way you've done it. And so it really does impress upon people, like you would have to change your rhythm. You'd have to change your operating model.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know in the academic world, which I'm most familiar with, it's oftentimes hard to move senior women professors because they have a spouse who is set up often in an academic world, because as a scientist, you meet your spouse in the lab oftentimes. And so it does bring up this idea that maybe some of the movement around the geographic barriers that I think are more of a hindrance for women, I would extrapolate to the business world relative to what we know in academia. You could maybe get around that with doing something virtually.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. If you said on a personal level, can I move from San Francisco? I have kids in school, and no, I have my husband who has a job. Like it's actually couldn't just pack my bags and go to Chicago.
Yeah,
If you said I only need to be in Chicago a couple times a month,
it totally changes that. That's really interesting. That's great to think about. Actually, at Barnard, we're thinking about the real estate all the time because, as you know, we have very little of it, and it's in a pretty expensive city. And so we're doing the same calculations I think a lot of companies are doing about what can be remote. Some of our IT and others, could we put more student space, more academic space on our small campus, because we don't need some of these functions right on campus.
Yeah, I also think people are thinking about how to be more intentional about where in-person and collaboration really makes a difference. And so by no means could we all just work from home permanently. I mean, there are moments and times and types of roles where it makes such a difference to be in person, as much as I'm a fan of all the collaboration technologies. So I think being more purposeful about when that is and making that count is also helpful. And I think a lot of women, at least women I've talked to have said, I'm fine to travel if it's with purpose.
Right.
But when you're wasting or disrespecting my time and just expecting me to be there 4 days a week because we haven't really organized how to use that time and I'm missing dinner with my kids, these feel like incredibly tough trade-offs.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of negatives associated with the Women in Workplace report, but what makes you optimistic? Are there any silver linings in the report or in your work? And then I want to ask you some questions about Barnard before we turn over.
I'd love to answer questions about Barnard. So one silver lining is we spent a lot of time looking at intersectionality. So we looked at LGBTQ women, women with disabilities, Black, Latinx, and Asian women. And I think the one thing that I took away, which is a silver lining, is that allyship really works and it really matters. So when companies say, like, what are 3 things I could do right away? I say you have to do the trio of allyship, sponsorship, and mentorship. And they will say, I know mentorship, I think I know sponsorship, but mostly. And they're like, what's allyship? And allyship is, we know for Black women that those women who have allies in the workplace are 2.5 times more likely to feel that the workplace is fair, to feel that they want to stay at that company, and to have a stronger aspiration to advance. And so allyship makes a huge difference, which is essentially, speaking up and speaking out for those of a different group. And I think what younger folks feel much more comfortable saying is taking your privilege and using it to help others.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, it's fascinating. Like, I don't think we had vocabulary like that when I was at Barnard, and I think almost all of kind of Gen Z do. And so understanding how to apply that at work and what that means is really, really important. So that's one silver lining.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what you were saying before about changing structures from the inside, right? Being there. My 9-year-old at her school, they talk about being a bystander versus an upstander. And I love that language. So we use it because the upstander says something and speaks up for others rather than just standing by. And so we talk a lot in our family about, are you being a bystander or upstander?
That is so great. I think all Barnard graduates are upstanders.
I think that's right.
From Barnard and not know that is the right door.
So going back to Barnard, I'd love to ask you a few questions about your experience there. I'm especially curious about your time in student government. You were president. What were some of the most important issues you were focused on, and what did you learn as you represented the student body?
Well, I loved it. At the time, I thought life doesn't get better. I was taking the most amazing classes. I had such amazing friends, and I was so honored to be student government president. One piece that we worked on a lot was sexual harassment on campus, and we did this in coordination with Columbia College and SEAS, and that was very meaningful. Another thing we worked on were I didn't fully probably have the language for it, but a couple of biases around sororities, biases around kind of women's identity and stereotypes that you might make or snap judgments you might make versus realizing more deeply that people are that those might lead you to the wrong assumptions. And so I do think the work we did on sexual harassment was really amazing. And then I also think there's something about for your cohort, for the 4 years of students who are there, is being a bit of a cultural keeper and just being part of the pulse of that moment in time. And so 95 was so long ago, but at that time, being relevant to what was, to the topics and issues and the feeling of being a student. And so I think that was really special. And then my favorite activity, which really pulled me into student government at Barnard, was I took a summer internship, or I guess a summer role, as part of the new student orientation program. I don't know if you still have it, but I thought, I was like,
NSOP.
Oh my gosh, NSOP,
our orientation, our OLs for NSOP, who are amazing.
Yes, and I just, it was the first time at Barnard, and it was kind of it wasn't a planned thing. I was like, oh, this looks interesting, and try it. And it was the first time at Barnard I felt like a leader, and I felt the ability to give back in a tangible way, and it was so fun. Oh,
that's great. That's a fantastic story. So let's turn. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I want to turn to some questions from the audience, if you don't mind. And we have questions from alums and students. And so I'll start with a question from Vera Vanderonsky, who's a first year, who's a parent of a first year, actually. And she says, what skills do you think are most important for college students to be successful in the modern workplace? So I think she's thinking about first year.
Critical thinking.
That's great. I love that. I mean, that's so Barnard, where we talk about, we're not teaching our students what to think, we're teaching them how to think. And you get that from this education across the arts and sciences.
Yeah, it's been the most valuable gift.
That's great. Okay, I have another one from Roxanne Kerr, who's a sophomore. She's class of 2023, and she wants to know, what are some of the ways McKinsey has been creative during COVID-19 in terms of the constraints that have been placed on the workplace and hiring and other?
Yeah, so many things that we've done. So First, we have had to digitize and use this format for all of our learning, all of our onboarding, all of our learning kind of more advanced skills, everything from cultural competency to, consulting skills to industry skills to also just learning the basics of our craft. And that has been a huge shift. We also do a program for next generation women leaders in countries outside of the US. And we did one in Europe where we previously in person would maybe have 100 women. We had like over 340 women. I participated in part of it. It was just so amazing to meet and connect with more. And you thought, oh, I don't know. And they kept saying, I'm not sure if the program will work that well this year, Lareina. I really hope we can find some amazing women. And we're like, oh my gosh. And so I think there's some surprises in using digital to connect to more people, but in a more intimate way. We also do something called an Ask Me Anything. And every week our managing director and two others and myself basically just open it up for any question. And that's
do you do this live?
We do it live.
Yeah. That's great. I love that. What are some of the questions you get? Like what has been unexpected?
We get everything. So people really don't hold back. It's like question from Seattle. I'm like, wow, you're up early. Question from, Dubai. We get all kinds of questions. So the funny questions we get is probably more personal questions like, what things have we made for dinner? Like recipe questions, questions about what we're doing to keep hope. So a lot of them are personal, and then a lot of them are like clarifying, like when we said that we had COVID days, like what does that mean? Does that mean? I was like, well, if I go on the website, it's policy. But so it can be everything, or even just they're not questions; they could be suggestions. Like they're framed as questions, but they're being like, it would be really great if, have you considered that? And we've implemented some of the ideas that have come in. So it's very free flowing. Certainly right after George Floyd, a lot of the questions were around racial equity. And I thought it was a really good moment. And some of them still continue to be, but to be very candid as a community, which I see a lot of companies doing.
That's great. And it opens up a whole sort of new channel of communication, which I think is great. And one that we're all getting used to communicating in.
Yeah.
So this question is from Tispia Raymond, who's a first year, class of 24. And Tispia asks about your tips for networking.
So I've never considered myself a great networker, so I will try more to speak to what I have researched are really good things to do. Sometimes you don't always apply them yourself. So a couple of things. One is I think that your greatest networks come from where you are actually doing work together. So let's say you're working, you're doing an internship, or you're taking a class with a professor, or you're in your first job. I think being proactive and reaching out to those that you're working with is a great thing to do. And keeping in touch with those people over time is part of what really great networkers do. And it doesn't need to be all the time, but it's the consistency of coming back, and coming back. And I think another thing is that it's perfectly okay to be vulnerable with someone that is one of your mentors, and it's perfectly okay to ask questions. You don't need to come in with all buttoned up with the answers. Most senior people know that that they are here to help you, and so in some ways, just have the courage to take the first step and initiate some of that. And really good leaders will also initiate it with you and open something up, and recognize that happens.
Yeah, I always say, you'd be surprised how likely people in leadership roles will be to respond and actually to talk to you, and that people, inherently like to talk about themselves. So if you have no questions, you ask a question about someone and their background and their experiences, and can be a great way to get a conversation started.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have another question. This is from Alice Chin, who's a alum from the class of '07, and this is a great question. So she asked about, what are the data validated practices that you include in your DEI work? And then on the flip side, she asked, can you give an example of a common practice that's not data validated that you'd like to see disappear?
Oh, a practice I'd like to see disappear. Oh, interesting. Well, the easier question would be, we do know that sponsorship works, formalized sponsorship programs with data behind it. And really the crux of sponsorship is opportunity creation. And I think that's particularly important for Barnard women, because for you, it's not a question, are you smart? Are you capable? It's a question of, do you have the opportunity to prove it and to show it? So I think that's one that I feel very strongly about, and I see it work really well. We talked about allyship. I think diversity of slates is a really important practice. And so some people call it the Rooney Rule. There are different ways to look at it, but essentially you want the final decision to be meritocratic. You want it to be based off of the most qualified candidate gets the role. The challenge is that qualified women aren't getting on the short list. So I'm a huge advocate of seeing more diverse slates, and then it should go where it goes.
So how do you enact that? Are there policies to help make sure those, or ideas? Yeah.
So some companies literally just, that is the policy, is that they, especially for senior positions, the final round has to have, if you have a final, like per se, your final round is 3 candidates, one needs to be different. So the example I like to use is you cannot have 3 Black women in the final round. You would need to add a white male. I just juxtapose it because that's rarely the situation we're in. But the idea would be, if you have one person that has a different profile, always in your final set. And what that forces is the organizations to look harder at who's potentially qualified. So that's something. I think if there is something to get rid of, I think one thing that's less helpful is what I call kind of hit and run training. It's like if you take 45 minutes of unconscious bias training, you will not get rid of all your biases, and you will not be really good at that. Or if I give you 45 minutes of inspirational leadership coaching, you will not be an inspirational leader yet. So I think sometimes it oversimplifies the real work in changing behavior.
Yeah, that's great, right? It goes back to this thing that I think it's like training. I mean, it's like practicing for a sport or anything else. It's got to be repeated and strategic and thoughtful and move forward, and not just sort of a one shot. This is a great question from Margaret Levy, who's class of '66, and she asks, do you ever see cases where minority members of companies are almost like pressured to take on DEI roles, and they don't necessarily have the training for them or the support for them? And what do you do?
I don't see that per se in DEI. I do see that senior women in particular often take on the stronger load on people type issues. So at its extreme, it's kind of called office housework. That's maybe a bit uncharitable and unfair. But I do think there's oftentimes like a default stereotype that women leaders perhaps are all caretakers, which fully stereotypes women, and that therefore people or cultural level responsibilities should be taken on by women. And that is just not necessarily the case. You want your very best people leaders to work on people and culture issues, just as you want your very best product leaders to work on product growth.
Yeah, that's great. And looking at the individuals and what their strengths are and what they're interested in. And it goes back to what you said about sort of pursuing your passions and going towards what you find interesting. I love this one because it's just very specific. This is from Ellen Offner, who's class of '61, and she talks about whether you have advice for a dance company to address DEI. 'I?
Yes, my application to Barnard suggested that I had a strong interest in dance and art, but then I spent no time.
I don't think Ellen is looking at your application.
Oh, how much we change. So I think for DEI for dance and arts, I'm not sure it'd be any different from how other organizations should think about it, which is I would start by looking at representation. And then I would spend the time looking at culture. And the heart of DEI work is creating inclusive culture. So what that focuses on is an exploration of what are exclusive behaviors, and where some of the biases are. So it kind of goes back to that very classic story about the symphony and the violinist, where women weren't making the first violin positions and weren't seeing themselves get opportunities in the best orchestras. But then when they covered it up and took their shoes off and you couldn't see whether the person playing was a man or a woman, women fared much better. So I think there is some exploration for a dance company to understand what those sources might be.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I imagine that is going to be specific to whatever industry or area you're working in, right? So what are the biases that come to the table and how do you think about dismantling them? Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I want to ask one question that's not on the list, but this is my personal question. And I think across these Insight series, we've been talking a lot about self-compassion and how we give ourselves a break. And I'm just wondering what you do to take care of yourself and relax or step away.
So the thing I've been trying to do is to take walks. And I will say that at first, at the beginning of COVID, it probably started with a loftier aspiration of true fitness and running. And you can say I kind of eased up on myself or just lowered the bar, you decide. But what I've realized is you can spend hours and hours indoors in calls like this, and you have lost the ability to go to lunch, the ability to actually drive somewhere, the ability to take a walk between buildings. And so in the afternoons, I try and parse an hour out for a walk. Sometimes I exercise, sometimes I don't, but the main thing is to go outside, and we live near the Presidio, so just being near the trees, that is incredible. And then sometimes it's a good time to call friends and catch up.
That's great. That's great. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Lareina. It's been really amazing to talk to you about such important issues. And it's so nice to see how much Barnard really has influenced you. And we love to hear from alums and to always work to support our students and alums in whatever way we can. So thank you for being here and for spending the time with us.
Thank you. And just a huge shout out to all those who joined.
So thank you so much, President Bylock, and thank you again, Lareina Yee, for spending time with us again this evening. As President Bylock mentioned, in December, Beyond Barnard will release its data on the first destination of the class of 2020, reporting on the jobs and graduate school outcomes of our most recent alumni. As ever, we are dedicated to presenting the most updated, accurate, and thorough information on outcomes. We'll share the final report on our website and via our Instagram. We always love getting more followers. Follow us at Beyond Barnard. I'll also echo the reminder to be in touch with us via beyondbarnard@barnard.edu. No matter whether you're a current student, a member of the class of 2020, or an alumna from any year, we encourage you to contact us to tap into supportive resources, to volunteer for events, or to serve as a mentor. I want to close this evening by saying thank you. Since May, we have met together for 7 Insights events. Each has provided a distinctive forum for the kinds of conversations and exchanges that represent the absolute best of the Barnard community. I hope that you've enjoyed them, and I look forward to picking things up again in 2021. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the upcoming holiday season. And in the meantime, please stay well. Good night.